Chapter 10. It's a Camel Thing. The next day saw the children sitting on a fence, feeding Dan and Daniela clumps of grass. The camels were looking much more relaxed and had become surprisingly friendly and trusting. They looked like camels that would give a score of 10 out of 10 if they were asked to do a Google review for their accommodation. Mrs. Nell was quite obsessed with them and had ordered bridles and saddle belts from a friend who did leather work. She wanted to learn to ride them. Mr. Nell, on the other hand, was not happy with the new farm additions and constantly phoned the stock theft unit. But each phone call was met with the answer, "No, sir, no camels have been reported stolen." He would sigh, mutter, "Very strange," and go off to attend to other matters on the farm. It was amazing going to ancient Egypt, but we haven't found out anything else about the stone or Temenhut, really, Peter said, stroking Daniela's nose and smiling at her funny flapping lips as she chewed. "No," Sam agreed, "but I guess we can assume that was a pyramid built for Temenhut, and I guess that ceremony may have had something to do with the stone or its magic in some way." He jumped off the fence to get another handful of grass for Dan, who was huffing hopefully into his face. "We need to find out the meaning of those hieroglyphs that you copied from the scroll. It's the only thing we have to go on with." "We have Professor Gamal's email on that card he gave us," Jane said thoughtfully. "He said he was an expert in hieroglyphics." "Yes, but that might be a bit dangerous. He was super nosy about our stone, and he's interested in amulets," Sam replied. "But if we email him and send a copy of the hieroglyphics, pretending to be somebody else, he won't be able to find us," Jane argued. "We can use my school email address. It doesn't give my name away." That should be okay, right?" Sam said, turning to Peter. Peter was silent, considering all the angles, and then he shook his head and replied, "Well, it would be obvious it's from a school. He will easily find out from the email address that it's from Lordsburg Primary, even if he doesn't have the identity of the sender. But is that a problem? Hold on, let me think." Peter absent-mindedly put one of the grass stalks he picked for the camels in his mouth and chewed. After a while he smiled triumphantly and said, "Yes, that's actually perfect. We can pretend to be a teacher from Lordsburg Primary who heard he is an expert in hieroglyphics and who is doing Egypt with a class and needs a translation." "That's inspired," Sam said, looking at Peter with admiration. "Let's do it now." Giving the camels a last pat, they trooped off to the farm computer, scanned the page of hieroglyphics from Peter's small notebook, and Jane logged into her school server. They spent a long time making sure that the email sounded as if it were from an adult. "Dear Professor Gamal," Jane read out when the final draft was done, "I am a teacher at Lordsburg Primary School and am doing ancient Egypt with my class. I believe you are an expert in hieroglyphics. I am attaching a scan of some hieroglyphics which I would greatly appreciate you translating for me. Yours sincerely, Mrs. G. Malotto." Mrs. Malotto was a history teacher, and the children were very pleased with themselves for thinking of using a real teacher's name. That would put Professor Gamal off the scent if he checked up on anything. Jane attached the scan of the hieroglyphics, and they all held their breaths as she clicked send. "I wonder when we'll get an answer," Maidie said. "Guess it depends on how often he checks his emails," Jane replied. "Come, let's go back to the camels. I want to try sitting on their backs. Then when Auntie gets the bridles, we can go riding out in the veldt." The others agreed. It seemed as good a way as any to pass the time as they waited for Professor Gamal to reply. But when they got close to the field in which Dan and Daniela graze, they got a horrible shock. Something was terribly wrong with Dan. He was foaming most horribly at the mouth, and it looked like his entire tongue was hanging out the side of it. "What's happened to him?" Jane cried in horror. "Look at his tongue." "Could it be a snake bite, or maybe he's eaten something poisonous?" Sam suggested breathlessly as they ran in a panic towards the farmhouse where they knew Mrs. Nell was doing the house accounts in the sitting room. "I don't know, but it looks awful," Jane panted tearfully. Mrs. Nell looked very alarmed when they burst in on her, and she realized something was wrong with the camels. But as she began to gather what the problem was from their garbled accounts, she began to smile. "It's all right. I think it's probably fine. When male camels try to attract females, they blow air into their palates, that's the roof of their mouths, and it blows up, inflates like a balloon, and hangs out of their mouths. Come, let me go and look. I'm pretty sure that's what Dan is doing. But that's totally weird, Sam said, voicing what the others were thinking. Well, it's a camel thing. One man's poison is another man's food, Mrs. Knoll said crisply, walking so fast up the slope to the camel's pasture that the children had to trot to keep up. She was a bit taken aback by the huge pink protrusion hanging from Dan's mouth. Reading about it and seeing it were two different things. But when she turned towards the children, she was smiling. It's fine. It's what I thought it was. He's just courting Daniela. Or turned to look at Daniela, who had her back to her palate-ballooning, spit-bubbling suitor and was nibbling delicately on some dried fragments of glass. She doesn't look very impressed, Jane said dubiously. No, she doesn't, Mrs. Knoll agreed with a smile, but Dan should be fine. In a small number of cases, the palate may stay inflated and not go back into place, or can get scratched or cut, but I think Dan will be quite safe in the pasture. Let's give them some privacy. Come, let's all go and have some tea and biscuits to help you recover from your shock. I'll come and check on them a bit later. After that episode, the children adopted the byline, "It's a camel thing," when they came across something which seemed so weird or silly that it defied their powers of understanding. Why do adults always ask you how school is going? Jane would ask. It's so irritating. It's a camel thing, Sam would reply. Or, why do grown-ups never want to eat raw cake? Peter asked. And Sam would shrug and say, it's a camel thing. The children kept checking Jane's email inbox with a frequency which made Mrs. Knoll tell them that they were having too much screen time and should go out and do something useful, like take the camels for a walk, or go and spring clean the hen hook, or pick the gooseberries, or. Her suggestions were numerous. After that, they tried to do it when no one was around, and were rewarded for their persistence on the morning of the third day when Jane's inbox showed an email from profjggamal@gmail.com. Hearts beating with excitement, they clustered around the computer screen, and Jane opened the email and read, Dear Mrs. Maloto, thank you for your email and the fascinating hieroglyphs. I offer the following translation. And King Temenhut, the unyielding and the great, was given the gifts of the god Ra, who broke off 2 pieces of his heart and gave them to the Earth King, who promised he would worship him above all other gods. The 2 sacred pieces fell into the great river and, cooling, became stone. And King Temenhut built a temple for each sacred one, and the floods came, and the time of grain and fruit was great, and there was no illness for those who came to Temenhut the healer, holder of the sacred stones, and those that he healed died only when the whiteness came to their hair. I was extremely excited to read this text, as it ties in with the fact that I have come across a passage recorded on the walls of the tomb of the last Egyptian pharaoh, Ptolemy XV, which mentions the loss of 2 priceless objects through theft, and links this loss directly with his death and the conquering of Egypt by Rome. I think that the 2 sacred pieces mentioned above may be 2 amulets which I have been seeking for many years, as they are of great archaeological interest. Please, can you tell me what and where the source was of the hieroglyphics you sent? I cannot tell you what an important breakthrough this will be for me. Yours in science, Professor Jafari G. Gamal. The children stared at each other in silence, their minds turning. They were all thinking the same thing. Their stone must be one of the 2 amulets Professor Gamal was seeking. And the fact that he was so desperate to find them suggested he knew that they held magical powers. Now I'm thinking it wasn't at all a good idea getting Professor Gamal involved. What on earth are we going to tell him about where we, or should I say Mrs. Malota, found the hieroglyphics? Peter said grimly. There's no rush to answer his email, Sam replied. Let's think about it for a day or 2 before we do anything. I agree, Jane said. We need to be very careful because it sounds like wherever we say we got it from, he'll go straight there and check. Sam, where are you? Mrs. Knoll's voice came floating up the stairs. Sam leaped up. He didn't want to be found at the computer again and shouted, Coming! Then said to the others, I'll go see what you want. Wait here. He came bounding back into the room after a few minutes, looking very excited. Remember my dad mentioned a while ago that a paleontologist from the Ezeco South African Museum wanted to come to the farm to look for fossils and to see our one? Well, they're apparently working in the area and they want to come to the farm tomorrow afternoon, and first thing they want to go and see our fossil. Mum promised we would take them. Peter smiled broadly and Maylie clapped her hands with glee. That'll be fun. I'm going to go and make my dolls smart so they're ready to meet them. And she scampered excitedly out of the room. Jane laughed as she turned off the computer. Well, I guess that's the last we'll see of her today. I feel like going for a swim in the dam. It's so hot. Do you want to come? Yes, Sam said. Good idea. Coming, Peter? Peter nodded, and the three of them thought no more about responding to the professor's email. The next afternoon was very exciting. 2 Land Rovers arrived at the farm, and the children discovered that they were filled with paleontology students from the University of Cape Town. The trip was being led by Dr. Makuna from the Ezeco Museum, who was training the students to do field work. The 4 children took the party up the disappearing hill and proudly showed them the cynodont fossil they had found, and which had resulted in the boys having their very first time travel adventure. They did not mention this aspect, of course, and hugely enjoyed asking the paleontologist questions about the fossil to see if it matched up with what they had observed when they had stumbled across a colony of cynodonts during their trip to the Permian. Dr. Makuna was very excited at the fact that the whole skeleton had fossilized, and also because he said he thought it was a new species of cynodont belonging to the Thrinaxodon family. He was very impressed that they had got as far as identifying it as a cynodont. Most impressive, he said. I just need to double check with some of the Thrinaxodon fossil material we have at the museum, but I'm pretty positive this looks like an entirely new species. And what makes it extra special is the fact that it is so phenomenally well preserved. He added that a couple of the students would come every day to prepare the fossil and cover it in plaster of Paris so that it will remain whole and undamaged when they cut it out from the surrounding rocks and took it to the museum. Once we've got it safely out, it will go to my laboratory in Cape Town where my specially trained preparators will draw away the surrounding rock with dental drills. Yep, you heard right. We use the same drills dentists use, with diamond tips, because diamonds are one of the hardest natural occurring substances on Earth. Once the skeleton is nicely exposed and most of the rocks surrounding the bones has been taken away, I will phone my good friend Dr. Tabiso, who's a cynodont specialist, and ask her to come and take a look. She's going to be so excited when she hears about this. And Dr. Makuna beamed happily at the children, who smiled back. They really liked the earnest, enthusiastic Dr. Makuna. The students were also all very friendly and fun to be with, and the children were thrilled when they invited them to come and have dinner with them at their accommodation on a neighbouring farm. It's the least we can do, Dr. Makuna said, after you've started our field trip off with such a bang by showing us your wonderful fossil. I would offer to fetch and bring you home, but unfortunately our Land Rovers are full. Can someone give you a lift? In the end, Peter's mother, whom Sam and Jane simply called Auntie, as although she was not a relative, she'd been part of their lives, particularly Sam's, of course, since they were babies. She said she would drive the children over as she was quite keen to talk to the paleontologists and hear about their work in the Karoo. The children had a wonderful evening with the students and Dr. Makuna, sitting under the stars and eating boerewors and chops, very garlicky garlic bread, and pap with tomato and onion sauce. Dr. Makuna and the students began to recall funny tales of digs and field trips they had gone on, and there was much laughing and merriment. It was very late when they left, and the children enjoyed the ride back to the farm. The dim hills and valleys they passed looked remote and mysterious in the dark, and the car felt cozy and snug. Maylie fell asleep almost immediately, lulled by the bouncing of the car on the dirt roads. When they got to the farmhouse, Mrs. October unlocked the doors, intending to let Sam and Jane out and then drive on down to her cottage further down the road. As the two climbed out of the car, she put the gears into reverse, then stopped. That was odd. The yard lights were on, but the house was in complete darkness, and Phoebe was barking at the window, thrilled at Sam's return. In the normal run of things, she would have been outside having a sniff around before bedtime. Mrs. October turned the engine off. Hang on, this is very odd. It looks almost like no one's here. Your parents wouldn't have gone to bed before you got back. Let me come in with you. Please join us next week for Chapter 11, The Darkened House.